Okay, and I'm going to share my screen. So let me know if you can see. Looking good. Okay. Can folks see the screen? Just want to confirm in the chat real quick before I get going. Awesome. Okay, so thanks so much for joining me to think and talk about space data today and how we might think about using that for making sort of audiovisual works. The rough outline for today is I'm going to talk a little bit about this current installation that's up at NAISA called Helios 2024 and show you some of the material that's gone into that. And then I'll kind of contextualize that by going into a bit of my previous work and where I'm coming from, my interest in space and sound. And I've kind of been playing around with turning certain areas of space into sound for about 10 years now, which makes me feel super old. But that's going to be the sort of the outline for the first little bit. And then we're going to move into thinking about the wider context of data in art. And I'll showcase some of the tools that I've been using, which is in that workshop files link, which I shared with you all. So for me, and this is going to be the easiest way to show you, is the actual project file itself. The tools that I use end up being fairly modular. I come from a sort of a more musical technology background. And for me, I kind of came into things from a production standpoint and then learned for a lot of trial and error, Max MSP. And so Max MSP kind of led me into a bunch of new pathways. So I employ kind of creative coding a lot of my work. And that initially started out sort of moving on from things like Max, which are more node-based programming, into sort of working with this environment called processing, which is based on JavaScript a lot. And that was kind of my main tool for quite a long time, really. And sort of from that moved into learning a bit more advanced data analysis work, using tools like Python quite a lot. And recently, it was about early pandemic, I discovered Touch Designer, which I really hated at first. But after a while, I found the UI very counterintuitive, but after a while, the kind of the tool clicked really well for me, and so now I employ that a lot in my work for working very modularly between sound and visual and data. It's a really powerful tool, and there's some experimental things that I've been working on with Touch for sound. It's not really a great tool for sound, which I'll show you today, but there's some interesting things you can do with it, and I'm still kind of working out the sonic potential of this as well. So in terms of what I would do in an installation such as Helios 2024, you can see some of the back end here in this very messy Max patch. I sort of work in individual cells. So I work on individual blocks of a piece and then kind of bring those together in essentially a sort of a generative choreography of things. And there's a number of different scenographies in this piece. So I'll kind of play through a couple of these. And hopefully we can hear some sound. I'll also turn off the sound so I can talk because I know it kind of destroys my voice a little bit. But so the scenes that make up this piece for New Adventures are, I was really interested in gathering a lot of real-time sun imagery because it's just such a striking body. So I have a couple of scripts running, and don't worry if this seems kind of a little techy. We'll kind of think more about these elements later. But I have a couple of scripts running, which is sort of gathering daily information from the sun, and then essentially cataloging that into a kind of a composite. So one of the things that kind of excites me about this is that over the course of the installation, every day we're adding to that data piece that the sun is putting out. Every day we're taking 24 hours worth of still images and putting that into sort of a composite collage. And so I think the installation is on for about 90 days. So at the end, we'll have 90 days of sun imagery, which will be sort of shown in this sort of composite. So this is very visual based. And so working with these systems is really just quite a very direct contextual way. I'll talk a bit later about how I would turn this type of imagery into sound and some of the quantitative and maybe more abstract ways I would do that. And if I go to scene, okay, so in this scene, I'm taking again this real-time data, which we can see on the right-hand side of the screen, and then I'm mapping that to immediately obvious phenomena in the sun, like sunspots and coronal holes. So we can see a kind of a simulation of a snapshot essentially of the sun over the course of that day. And so I have the sun updating about every 10 minutes. The information is not quite real time coming in. Satellites are sort of sending this back in dribs and drabs. But I'm able to collect, and it's updating automatically this satellite data about every 10 minutes. And something I've been exploring a lot in terms of my sort of sonification practice is finding the most simplistic kind of vertices for carrying information and translating that to sound. So in the scene that we're seeing here, I'm taking an array of pixels across the sun, which we can see in this sort of wavelength of light that I can move between. That's also altering the visual. Let's move that so we can see. So as we move to different wavelengths, we see different phenomena occurring based on that wavelength. So it's sort of updating in real time on this kind of more abstract visualization. And then the sonic element is built up of three very simple components. So one's like an oscillator bank that is just playing back all these different components of the image bank here. So as I move across, you get these very subtle changes. It's really quite a subtle vibe. There's also a noise-based interpretation of those sunspots and the frequency of how many sunspots. So right now, there's not that many large sunspots on the surface. So that noise component's quite subtle. If there are a lot of components on the surface, it would be much more vibrant and loud. And then additional components kind of playing back, basically treating this as a wave shaping tool. So taking this array of pixels and just using that to play back a phase as a wave shape. And because the data is quite self-similar, the vibe tends to be moving between those wavelengths quite similar. But if you put in something that was radically different in terms of input data, like just an image of your face, it would really interpret that sound differently. Okay, it's actually playing through the main output. So there's a kind of an older work which is also incorporated into this, which is sort of playing playing in the background in various ways. I did quite a lot of the work for the sun in about 2018 and mapped it in various ways. So this is taking some of those mappings and feeding that back into taking that code and dissecting the sun in various ways. So taking the most prevalent sunspots and building that into kind of zoetropic imagery and things like that. Elements of the installation just kind of mix and meld components together. And then this final piece, which is sort of the most classically kind of quantitative response to the data, where I'm basically taking tabulated sunspot data from about the year 1820 to now, and I'm cycling across that, creating this graph. Basically, the response in audio terms is really simple. Every year, I'm calculating the number of sunspots that happened in that year. So, for example, 1993, 26,308, and that's going to respond to the speed of a ticker. This variable here is altering some sort of very basic effects. But basically, as we go through the data, we sort of hear a ticker that's cataloging that data year by year. And I have control over things like how fast we're moving through that data. So that's kind of the basic sort of components of what's going on in the installation that's at NAISA. And I know not everyone's going to obviously be able to see it in person, but I've tried to catalog quite a lot of this through film as well, what's in the space. There's a couple of components that we can't, let's get my slides back up. There's a couple of components that I can't showcase today because they're sort of space specific. So there's two components that are also physically in the space that I wanted to showcase. And so one is I've done a lot of work in the past on basically getting data into sort of these laser cut discs. So in about 2018, I started making locked grooves in various materials. This one's in cardboard, and basically these locked grooves, extremely low quality. With a laser, you can't cut much more than sort of an 8-bit audio file. And it takes a really long time as well. But with a locked groove, I had the ability to have something that could just be placed on and would continue essentially forever. And it led into a question I had around the work that I was doing with data. I've done a lot of stuff with sort of turning data into visuals and then later turning data into sounds. And for me, that process of translation is what's really interesting, is one, how we collect that information, and then two, how do we read through that information, interpret that? What are the stories that we're choosing to utilize? What are the narratives that we're imposing on that data? Are we filtering that data? Does the technology have a bias towards how that data is processed? So for me, the physical aspect of the record became this really nice way of sharing information, in the fact that you could share a piece of information, a very short piece of information that's a physical artifact, and that artifact would also degrade over time. So the number of times it's played, every time it's played, it reduces in quality from the needle scratching into it. Dust will get into the groove. So it's an imperfect way of containing a piece of information and storing that and sharing that. But for me, it really is a nice analogy for how we are engaging with data on a day-to-day basis. And, we see things all the time, like there's massive amounts of financial data that sometimes just accidentally get deleted, wiping billions off the stock market. And we have this very concrete relationship to a very abstract set of numbers quite often. So having something in a physical form so we can kind of hold it and feel it and see how it degrades, I think for me is really interesting. I'm going to share my screen again. And the second component that is in the show that is kind of important for me is I've done a lot of work with this sound spectrum, or this radio spectrum called very low frequency. And that was kind of what has started me on this path of engaging with information and data from space. Basically, the very low frequency radio band encapsulates radio that's naturally produced within the Earth's ionosphere. So this contains things like the northern lights, lightning striking from all over the world. And you can listen to it through just building these extremely large coils of wire. It's a very simple thing to actually access once you've built a big coil. And for me, that led me on to the stuff I'm doing now, because essentially a big VLF antenna is essentially a very low quality radio telescope. And that realization kind of early on for me when I was building these things, that a lot of astronomy is done through radio waves rather than through optical imaging, was really transformative in this way that I started to rethink the kind of the way that information was presented. Because a lot of times when we see information, particularly disseminated from space organizations, we see these beautiful artistic renderings of what a planet in a faraway galaxy looks like that they found that is in the Goldilocks zone and the perfect place for potential life. And we see these beautiful renderings as if it's a real thing that's been seen through a telescope. And it's essentially mapping various radio spectrum to have an understanding of the kind of the composition of that planet and some kind of light frequencies too. But it's this kind of concreteness of image that's made from data. Again, it's applying a personalized narrative from the people engaging with that data. And so for me, that led me on to this sort of work with VLF. And I've got a couple of videos of what that looks like in the space. I'm choosing to visualize it in a quite basic way through old CRT technology. And just hit me up in the chat if you can still hear. Hopefully you can. So what's happening here is I'm using that antenna to take a real-time feed of that radio spectrum, the VLF radio spectrum coming in. And what we can hear a few things. We can kind of hear a pervasive hum. And this comes from, in addition to the fact that we can hear all these wonderful ionospheric sounds, we also, it's the perfect range for man-made electromagnetic emissions. So we can hear the mains grid really prevalently. That's a low 50 or 60 hertz hum, depending where in the world you are. But those nice clicks and crackles that we can hear coming through, that's the most prevalent sound in the natural band that's coming out is lightning. And so basically when lightning strikes the Earth, it's then bouncing, its radio signal is bouncing between the Earth and the ionosphere. And that creates these little tweaked radio emissions called spherics. And there's a wonderful piece by the composer Alvin Lucier, where he spent a lot of time going to quite remote places away from lots and lots of electrical signals and recording these spherics. And you know, for many people, hearing them can be quite a transformative experience, because they kind of have no, that they sound like radio static in a lot of ways, but they have this sort of ethereal quality of kind of cutting through the ether. And so it's a really nice thing to be able to hear. I find it extremely meditative. So that's a piece that's sort of continuously just broadcasting in the space. And the visualization is sort of just a very simply distorted audio spectrum. I'm taking that information of that, the audio spectrum as a spectrogram coming through, and I'm just slowly distorting that over time based on the amount of activity in the VLF band. So you get a slightly warped visual spectrum. And then the other piece, or pieces, I have wanted to show you a very quick example of what the radio, of what the record might sound like. And again, we'll hear it's quite noisy. So when you're in the NAISA space, you hear sort of a nice ambient soundscape of lots of clicks and crackles, and sort of situating yourself in a number of ways of working with the sun and working with sort of cosmic information. The reason that VLF is sort of relevant in this context is because most of these signals are produced by the interaction between the sun and the ionosphere, which is sort of this area that protects us essentially from solar radiation. So through those interactions, we get increased activity from, spherics. We can hear them propagating more when there's high amounts of sun activity. And of course, in the context of hearing the northern lights, when there's large amounts of solar activity, that's when northern lights occur, and that's when we can hear that magnetic radio band. So there is a very kind of concrete relationship between this band and our ionosphere and this interaction with the sun, which is quite exciting for me. So the work kind of is a continuation of sort of an ongoing interest in the sun and solar data, which I kind of started exploring in about 2018 as part of a show for the Factory Media Center in Hamilton. And as part of that, I got to catalog a year of the sun and turn that into a few things. I made a 25-minute film that took that information and sonified and visualized it in different ways. And if you click this little image on the side here in the slides, it will take you to that film so you can watch it at your convenience. And it also kind of allowed me some time and space to cut those radio discs, to cut those laser discs. And there was a secondary component where I worked with some poets who knew nothing about sound and nothing about data from space, but we worked together, and I kind of showed them what I was doing, and they reinterpreted that information through poetry and kind of concrete poetry, which we recorded and made some audio works, which was also in a little chat book, which was at the front of the gallery, so people could listen to those poems as a kind of a secondary component to these things, which were more correlative to the data. We had sort of things that were more abstract as well. And I want to go to the next slide. And even further back, that kind of was preceded by a lot of work in a installation series that I was working on called Turbulent Forms. And I think back in first iteration would have been in like 2015, 2016, and I did a version with New Adventures in SOUNDart in 2017, which was funded by Arts Council England. And this had a large number of sort of installations based around data from space and interpreting it in different ways. And for me, one of the more successful ones was this piece called Nova, which was sort of a more immersive space with sound and imagery. And I was interpreting basically this notion of supernova and the experience of supernova. So basically, I created a very simple mapping of all the supernovas that have ever been experienced by humans or seen by humans. It's kind of very interesting for me because it's quite a basic visualization, really. So we basically have these rectangles. The size of the rectangle represents the size that was interpreted by that supernova and placed in time. So this is the furthest back, and this is the present day. And for such a simple visualization, it really carries a lot. We can see these massive events which were really just word of mouth and historical record that was speculated to have been supernovas, these kind of biblical cataclysmic events that people talked about. And then we go down into the present day and we see there's so much information. And so this is now when we have satellites mapping the sky to catalog all this stuff. And I think, again, that kind of enforces this idea of what is data in terms of how is it cataloged. You know, it's not that there are more supernovas happening today than there were several thousand years ago. It's just that we have the apparatus to detect that. So a lot of times I think we need to keep in mind that the data that we are accessing is not complete. There's always going to be errors and things that are missing in data, even with very sophisticated systems. And so that's something that's kind of continually obviously going to improve. But I think that's an important thing to remember for folks that want to see any of these things. I've linked to pretty much everything. I'm not going to play too much of this because I want to get into the sort of the workshop phase. But around the time of making these works, I sort of started to think about the way I was working with data and trying to contextualize it a bit, because for me, I was just really interested in space and I didn't really know why. And so thinking about it was quite a challenging thing, of not really the how of how to do this stuff, but really the why of why do I want to do it. And I sort of, as part of some of these early workshops, developed a few ways of thinking and talking about data and using these as strategies, I guess, to work in. And so the most obvious for me that I was doing at the time was this quantitative analysis. So really just taking information and making these quite straightforward basic mappings. So for example, if we went and looked at the sunspot graph, which I was showing you at the beginning of the workshop, so something like this. And then as we move through that kind of more basic, kind of just like a direct interpretation, which I think in itself can be quite interesting, because obviously when we are hearing something, it sounds different to how we might imagine. So we can interpret information in an aural sense as well as a visual sense. And this actually has been quite important for discovering some things in kind of astronomy, where these massive data sets don't make much sense when you look at them. But if you turn them into sound, even if that sound is very basic, kind of new trends in the data emerge. So that was kind of number one. And then the second thing, which for me is really the most interested, is this abstract kind of storytelling potential of data. And this is where you aren't necessarily really being true to a data set or even using a data set at all, but you're trying to use a simulation or a piece of art or an experience to convey the core of a principle. So an example of that I tried to sort of work on early on in that initial turbulent forms show was using a process called can't remember what it's called. If I go to this page, generation loss. And essentially generation loss is where information is lost on repeat access, repeat plays. So we've all seen this if we've, when you get those pieces of paper that have been photocopied 100 times and all that stuff that was really clear in the first pass when it was printed has kind of become fuzzy around the edges. Sometimes it has even fully vanished. So in this example, I really created an analogy between the cosmic microwave background, which has been degrading massively over time. Of course, when we see it now and when scientists kind of visualize that, they're really having to work hard to get that information. So this kind of cosmic energy, which emanated when the universe sprang into being, is, has degraded over time. So kind of creating a very simple kind of analogies between things. And then collisional would be more like the NOVA project. And here are some examples from that first show of how I was sort of working. And this was really, for me, quite early on in terms of like thinking and formalizing this stuff. So I worked with sunspots. I guess my interest in the sun was still kind of quite prevalent at that point back in 2015, 16. And this would be the kind of the generation loss kind of example where we take something and we see how it degrades over time. And this kind of process can be applied to all sorts of data and information, particularly for sound. It can have a really interesting output. And also sort of working with folks to create simulations. I spent some time working with some scientists to kind of create a relatively accurate mapping of black holes colliding. I don't know if this was on folks' radar, but a few years ago, they sort of found, it's probably like, yeah, it's quite a while ago now, nearly a decade. But the first time that they kind of found a concrete signal of two black holes colliding was a really exciting discovery for folks. Finding out that these gravitational waves were created when a massive event on that scale would happen. And there's a process to that. So there's this initial distortion and shrinking of these black holes' orbits, and essentially over time they merge together, and they have this ringing kind of ending point. Essentially, like if you've ever dropped a coin down one of those spinny vertices at a museum, essentially it's like that kind of process as they spin round and essentially they collide and then create this massive amount of energy. But for using kind of simulation processes, we were able to sort of recreate that patterning and then apply that to various sounds. So this kind of spans a few of those classifications. It has some quantitative actual data from the initial LIGO experiment, and then it has some more sort of narrative components. So we're creating a simulation of what would happen if two of these objects collided and cataloging all that movement data and then turning that into sound. And the LIGO initial sonification from the research team doing that is a really good example of how audio from space is shared in the media. I remember it coming out, and there are these big articles like the sound of two black holes colliding. And of course, there's no acoustic waves in the sense of that we might think because it's in space. So this is all taken from these readings on Earth of this kind of huge cosmic event. But again, I found that presentation of the data really interesting. And if you heard the sonification itself, it's a little bit underwhelming. It's sort of like a long sine tone, and then you hear a little wobble. And the wobble is that deviation, because basically the LIGO experiment, which they were basing that sonification off, is two really long corridors, kilometers long, and a laser is going along each one. And basically the goal is that it's exactly measured. So the laser takes a precise amount of time to reach one end of the corridor where it's been recorded, and both are completely synced, but they're in different locations. So if there's a deviation between the laser timing, that would imply that there has been a cosmic gravity wave. And so that would be the sonification that they were basically shown, which is just that deviation between those two lasers as the gravity wave pushes through them. And again, a sort of a more collisional approach, which was the last thing I kind of was playing around with, was really just pushing everything into a gigantic pot and just seeing what would happen. It's completely chaotic, but sometimes out of that chaos, you can potentially get something that's interesting. The most fluxus approach to working with data. I also wanted to present a few things outside of my practice of people working with data as their medium. This is from a course I'm teaching right now at York that kind of is about fourth-year students working in teams to work on sort of a meaningful data visualization and sonification project. But I just wanted to incorporate this just because it has a bit more of a contextualization of what visualization and sonification is. if folks aren't so familiar with that. And some really big names in the field, I'm just going to kind of rattle off. One person that's super influential to me and a lot of folks, and been having a lot of trouble with my ad blocker no longer working. So I switched to Braves. This is a tip for anyone. Okay. So Ryoji Ikeda is a massive name in the world of sort of media arts. He's been going for quite a while. And a lot of his work is categorized by a really intense display of light, and particularly strobing, essentially. But often the strobing of these lights represents bits of data. So he's had a long track record of working with data in its really base form. So taking kind of bits and bytes and visualizing that as just ones and zeros, black and white. His later works have become really expansive. So the piece I was sort of playing through is called superposition. And in a sense, you could think he's doing that more collisional approach to working with data, where he just takes all these data sets from neuroscience to quantum physics and astronomy and just collides them together and just creates this experience of overwhelm where you're just moving between that data at really fast speeds. And a big factor of a lot of these works is, for me at least, there's like a retinal imprint, because you see something for a split second, and often there's certain elements which are emphasized through a particular frequency of bright light, and it's almost like etched onto your eyeballs. So even though you see it for 1 or 2 frames, it kind of stays with you, especially for some of the text pieces he was working with. Another artist who I'd highly recommend checking out is another Japanese artist called Ryoshi Kuwakara. And he has a more sort of audio-visual approach. He's more of a performer than sort of someone who does installations. But his work's really fantastic. And a lot of the work is taking, particularly the later work, is taking information from nature, particularly these, he was really early in the game on taking like big 3D scans of spaces that were in endangered areas and sort of remapping those and then manipulating those. And there's a component of that data that's controlling his synthesizers. So he's definitely a person to check out. He makes some really nice organic work in this sort of hybrid field of audiovisual art. Someone else, I worked on this project actually, is a fashion designer called Flora Miranda. And initially, the project was to work with a ballet company in Germany to create garments that represented 1-minute chunks of the audio score, which was by a composer called Alvin. And so that project initially was to map that data in various ways into sort of these abstract sonifications, sort of like the way I'm visualizing that VLF data. A very similar process was actually used for that. Remember that CRT screen we saw? And we're taking that spectrogram, which is a concrete interpretation of that audio signal, and then we're manipulating it and kind of playing around with how far away we can pull it before it doesn't have a meaning. But taking elements like the structure and the color from that audio spectrum as well. So that was sort of that project. And what was interesting for me is how there was a sort of a combination of physical and digital work. So I would work digitally, and then she and her team would interpret some elements through digital reproduction, quite a few elements, like actually this dress was mostly made by hand. So it was kind of an interesting process. again, I wanted to position some physical artists making as well, because I'm definitely getting to this point where I work with technology so much, but I'm also very interested in the sort of the core strategies of how we work with data and represent this information. I'm really interested in ways that we can work in these ways without actually having to touch a computer at all. And a really good example of someone doing this is Natalie Maybach, or I don't know if any folks are familiar with, but Natalie has a big practice of being particularly interested in weather data and creating her own sort of keys for reinterpreting that data as a series of sculptures. And so I'm really fascinated by her work because it's a way of sort of being inspired by data and utilizing data at a quite concrete level, but not really touching a computer. And so I wanted to position some of these works as well for folks who may be more interested in doing physical reinterpretations. Some of the data we look at today can very easily be interpreted physically as well. And I think in terms of this idea of telling narratives and stories around data, we have this idea that everything has to be reproduced using a computer, but it doesn't. We can create those narratives ourselves. It could be a text-based score or a performative event that puts someone in the position of experiencing a particular piece of information that we want to convey. And that can be just as powerful as a very analytical computational response. And this piece as well, which I think is the final piece of sort of the artists I wanted to share, there's an amazing group from the UK called Semiconductor. And they very, very often work at this intersection between art and science. They were one of the early sort of art science artists who would embed themselves in scientific institutions and spend a good chunk of time there, actually being around the scientists. I think they were one of the first people to make art from kind of being at CERN. So they have a really long track record, but this is a really nice piece that kind of combines physical elements. So these physical sort of very large panels cut using plasma cutters to represent various types of information from the Large Hadron Collider, and then a sort of a more mechanical instrumentation that's responding to that. Again, just I guess to showcase a project that is, it's a data project, but it's not engaging with computers really at all, is this project called Dear Data, which is a really lovely reciprocal project between two artists living across an ocean, sending very, very regular postcards that were mapping out data from their day-to-day lives and showcasing all sorts of different methodologies for turning that data into some kind of pictographic information. So particularly interested in this section where they're taking data from their life and just putting that into a musical score. But it's a really nice project. There's a big book of all these postcards and these strategies. So for folks as well who don't want to make with computers all the time, it's a really nice way of thinking about things. And in terms of sort of my tool set and the progression of the tools that I've used, I sort of, as I kind of mentioned, I initially was introduced to this world through tools like Max MSP, but I didn't really ever use it early on for doing anything with data. So for me, my introduction to working with information would have really been with processing and all these images are linked if you want to download any of these tools. And then if you're working with processing, I kind of got involved working with bringing that information into Max and sort of seeing different ways of turning that into sound. I was also a bit more, I'm very into open source, but over time there's some tools like PD, which I used to teach quite a bit, that have been there's been less of an appetite for people to learn pure data. So pure data is sort of like a free open source version of Max MSP. I don't kind of work with it so much anymore just because there's so much kind of going on in Max. It's such a great tool. PD is also a very good tool, but it's just there's partly because I teach at a university in digital media, there's a bit less of an appetite for students to learn that. So I kind of have migrated a lot of my practice just to Max, just because it is, even though it's a software you have to buy, it has a great 30-day trial, which I think you've all signed up for. And you really can use it in perpetuity. So that 30-day trial is a period where you can save your own project. So if you want to build and develop in Max, then obviously the ability to save is really important. But there's so much great stuff that's made by other people. For example, the tools I'm going to share a bit later, there's a variety of tools in Max. After that 30-day trial, you don't lose access to those tools. You just can't save any kind of computational updates you would make, but you can still access Max as a way to run other Max patches. And there's an amazing community of people online working with Max. So it's still useful after its 30 days are over. I kind of moved into Python a little bit later. That was kind of my pandemic thing, was I'm going to teach myself about Python so I can get into doing some AI stuff. And so I use Python quite regularly. It's really, really very handy for a lot of regular data tasks. It's also the language that Touch Designer is based on. So you can do scripting in Python within Touch Designer, which is great. And then Touch Designer kind of came to my workflow last, but currently it's probably the tool I go to the most. It's also, I find it to be exceptionally fun. So when I'm sort of able to have some downtime, I'll either play difficult platform video games. So I play this game called Celeste a lot and just try and speed run that. It's kind of a little bit obsessive. Or I will go into Touch Designer. So Touch Designer is both sort of has really kind of become my job because I do a lot of development of Touch Designer installations for other folks. It features in my own work. And then I also teach about Touch Designer at York. So it kind of figures into my job, but then also it's fun enough for me that I kind of go to it when I have downtime and just want to mess around. So from hating it and not wanting to have a look at it to spending any element of free time I can get using Touch Designer, it's definitely a tool that I would recommend at least playing around with and looking at. Some other useful tools that will be good for you. A good text editor is going to be really useful. You can use the inbuilt one on your computer, but I'd recommend, if you get really into this stuff, getting a specific text editor for code and getting something that can also handle sort of doing data bending and hex editing would be kind of interesting. But for the time being, just the native text editor is fine. You can do all sorts of interesting things with a text editor, including opening an image file as text, deleting parts or copying parts and creating a glitched version of that. A notebook is really useful as well, because for me, I find it quite hard to hold a lot of stuff in my head, particularly when you get into looking at big spreadsheets of data and you only want to access a few variables from that. So having a notebook where you can write out what that data is, you can have kind of a running tally of the columns that you actually want to use and their names. It makes it a bit easier to figure out stuff. And I quite often just, like I'm doing an installation now about moonquakes, so seismic activity on the moon, and just like very basic renderings of how an installation might look. This would be an 8.1 channel piece, and it has no representation really at all of what the sound will be like. But for me, I find doodling is really helpful for me to sort of process information and make some strategies, even though I'm a very, very bad drawer. Audacity is also a really useful tool for getting into working with data as audio. It's a very, in a lot of ways, it's a very basic tool, but it's free. And it also has a great ability to open up raw data. If you do open up raw data, I'd advise being careful. It's always exceptionally loud. So don't listen to it with headphones, and put it down to the lowest volume you can before playing it back. But it's a very interesting way of sort of analyzing files and hearing the internal structures of various files. It also provides a lot of utilities for working with audio outputs really quickly, where you don't need fancier software. And of course, some kind of good tool for editing data or viewing data that's in spreadsheet or comma-separated value formats. And finally, for folks that are really into getting into specifically astronomical data, there's a tool called SAOimage that allows you to in-depth visualize information. And there's so much stuff associated with it. I am absolutely in no way expert at using this tool, but I do enjoy playing around with it. You can get a lot of cool stuff. I won't be showcasing this today, but for folks that want to dig a little deeper and see scientific grade tools for interpreting data from space, it's a great platform to use. And finally, in my tools of choice, I will recommend to you ChatGPT. For me, I'm not someone that's great at math, and I can figure things out if I spend enough time with it. But the kind of work that I want to do is often about, I'm good at finding data. I'm good at the creative coding side and putting that into various kind of contexts. But that can often be slowed down if it takes you 3 days to work out the math. So I employ ChatGPT quite often for just passing in a data set. So recently I've been looking at satellite data and passing in a data set. And really what I want to know how to do is not analyze the data set in a way. I know how to access all that information and grab it and put it into various pieces of software. But for me, it's really just a very basic calculation of how do I take those satellites and calculate orbits. And through using tools like ChatGPT, it takes out a lot of the pain. You have to have a conversation with it in a sense that it's very often not correct first, second, even the third time. You have to coax it to get the result you want. That is also the correct result. But in terms of being a time saver for folks that maybe aren't so comfortable with coding or aren't so comfortable with math, it's a very useful tool to be aware of. And in this instance, it took at least 3 or 4 hours of my time sitting down with a piece of paper trying to calculate these, even though it's a simple calculation. There would have been a process of trial and error to work that out as well, and reading through different journals on how to actually map satellite orbits. It saved me a lot of time. So I'm going to put it out there that it's a good tool. And for me, the important part is getting the information into a workable format in a tool like Touch Designer or processing, that I can then actually just work with it and do the creative bit, rather than that whole bit at the beginning where you have to just have your thinking cap on and do a lot of difficult parsing. Okay, I'm gonna suggest we take a very short 5-minute break because I want to get another cup of tea. And also it's a good chance for us to kind of process some of this information before we jump into actually working with data and sound. I'm gonna leave up this slide here. So if you could download these files. I think the workshop's scheduled into 2, but I'm very happy to go longer than 2 if we need the time as well, to make sure everyone understands these files, and if certain folks want to stay around at the end and ask questions, totally fine. I'm happy to go until 3, but obviously I know, sorry, 4, do a 3-hour workshop rather than a 2-hour one. But obviously I know folks have other commitments as well, but we'll try and get through as much as we can in the 2 hours. So I will see you back here at 2:05. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and I'll try and answer them after the short break. Hey, hello, welcome back. Hope everyone is doing good. So if you haven't already, please try and download these workshop files. Once you have them downloaded, it should look a little bit like this. And you'll have this data NAISA Sonify folder. There's going to be a little folder with some practice data sets. And there's a folder of new and old.
Dan,
Hey,
hi, it's Kat. I'm not getting a hot link on the workshop files text.
okay. I'll copy it into the chat as well. Is
Okay,
anyone
great.
else experiencing that issue? So that should work.
Mm, mm,
And
uh,
what I was going to do is I was going to kind of hop through a few of these things before looking specifically. We'll kind of do some workshops around the new ideas. But I also wanted to just give you a quick run through of some of these old techniques. And these old techniques are not necessarily the best way of doing stuff, but it sort of gives you an idea into that process as well of how I've evolved in this method of working with data. And the first thing I wanted to show you,
mm.
are you okay, Kat?
Uh, I'm not sure what I'm getting. I'm getting NAISA Sonify, two items, 5 items.
Yeah,
That a new old?
it
That's
should be
it?
yeah, that's correct.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay, thank you.
you should be able to see on the screen. Let's see. Yeah. Are
Uh,
you able to see the folder I have on my screen that says NAISA Sonify, and I have data, new and old?
okay, yes, I seem to have just deleted one of them,
Okay.
the new one.
No worries.
Okay.
And so, for me, a lot of this has been just a long process of figuring it out, trying to do things that I think are going to be cool and not really knowing how to do it and spending a lot of time probably doing the wrong thing. So I thought I would share some of these things to sort of help you along and also have some of the outputs of that. So for those of you that are familiar with Maximus P, I'll bore you by just doing a quick description of what it is. So Maximus P is a pretty multi-use platform, but particularly it's really good for working with audio signals. And it can do image stuff as well, but it has three components really. So it has a component for working with numbers and information, a component for working with audio signals, and a component for working with video. And we can kind of get an idea what type of information is what by the color of the cables. The first thing you might want to do, and you won't need to do this today, but if you actually want to create your own patches within Max, you need to get comfortable with this lock and unlock panel here. So when the patch is unlocked, I can move things around, I can make edits and add new objects. But when it's locked, it really acts more as just a piece of kind of visual code that you can interact with. And everything should be hooked up more or less so that it should work. Obviously, there's always variances on folks' computers. But the first thing I wanted to introduce folks to that's an interesting tool for working it with data in Max is this thing called the col object. And also, cat. Oh, sorry, I thought someone's mic was on, but it's just me. So the first thing that I wanted to introduce you was to this col object because we're going to look at all these different CSV data files. And we're going to see that they're not really formatted in a way that's necessarily useful for us in Max. Col is one way of storing large amounts of data in Max quite effectively. And the format for a col is you start off each row. So each row of representation you want to represent, it has to start off with an index. So you can see here how this first value is going up incrementally. That's my index. So when I try and select a specific index of information, that is the piece, that's the index that denotes that. And then it's not a particularly nice format of information to look at, really, because you basically then have your values. And so you have your value, and then the separator to define a separation between values is just a space. So it's quite hard to visually see when you're looking at a col. And again, you have another piece of information, and then you can have as many pieces of information as you like in that col going across per row. But when you finish that piece of information, it's important to finalize that with a semicolon to let it know that that's finished. And what this then allows is we can then basically scrub through. That's a great question, Deb. I do not know if it means collate. I always thought it meant column, but collate might actually make a lot more sense in terms of naming. And then that first component we saw, that index. So it's automatically loading in a piece of information. It's loading in this file here called voyout.txt, which I've pre-formatted to be in the col format. And then we can move through that. And we see the index, we get a different output. I'm just going to preface that col is not the most efficient way for doing things, but I wanted to present that as a way of storing and recalling data in Max. Another way that we could work is with text, the text object, which we will see. And sometimes in Max, we get these weird little errors where things don't quite align. So sometimes we will find an issue like this where it's like no text object. And sometimes it can be as simple as just closing and reopening that patch. It's a pretty robust software, which is why it's good for teaching, but sometimes there are little glitches. Interesting. Okay. So sometimes closing it and then opening the help file also works. But then we can see that same piece of information has been loaded into that line text file and can be scrubbed through. The benefit about a text file is it doesn't have to be formatted in a specific way. So in the way that we formatted that col to be index, comma, space, data, a text file will just output anything that's in that data file. So for example, if I go and take this sat CSV, it will load that in and be super messy, but we can read out that information. And a great way of reading out information from a text object is, when we don't quite know the structure of it, is to create a message object by pressing the M key on our keyboard when we're in edit mode. And then we can see that there's a big chunk of text coming out. And so in this case, it might not be that useful, but the text object can let us see essentially how this is made up. So we have all this naming convention, and then we can unpack particular pieces of information based on their index. So we can see different indexes of data. Of course, a lot of this is just going to be, at this point, just text data. So we're just going to get a big old 0. So these are sort of the baseline ways in Max of working with certain pieces of information. And so this is sort of, we won't be looking at that so much today, but actually let's do something with sound that takes in this information. It's sort of the next step. So in this ordification folder, we've got a few different patches, but let's look at ordification single. And what we can do to make this work is we can hit this bang, and it's going to populate a buffer. Now, before we actually listen back to this, I want to mention a couple of things. So there's 2 different methods that we're going to think about today in terms of what we do. And primarily, I'm going to start us off with this idea of what's called ordification. We've talked about sonification, but I want to present ordification to you. And ordification is not as cool as sonification, but in a lot of ways, I think it's more interesting. The difference is, so when we hear about a sonification, essentially, it's a big old data set, and different elements of that data have been mapped to different sonic control values. So often this is more aligned to synthesis, where we take a synthesizer or a VST and we control things like the cutoff and we control the pitch. And there can be multiple parameters that are controlled by this data. And this is great, and it can sound really interesting, but often a lot of shaping goes into this to make it sound actually musical. Because if you just have a sequence of sort of random pieces of, random numbers going in that aren't mapped to a scale, it's going to sound noisy and not very nice. So a lot of narrative goes into this, and so this is most of the audio data we hear is in sonification terms. Now, ordification to me is really interesting because what it's doing is it's really the closest you can get to a direct transformation of a piece of data into an audio wave. And when we think about audio, when we listen to digital audio, every second of audio we hear is 44,100 samples. And so that is basically these little chunks of time making up at each second that are controlling basically the pressure in our headphones or our speakers. So we can basically create a piece of data that has this same property. And then when we run over it, a nice way of thinking about it is have you ever done something with a, like those, I think it's called like a guaro, where you scrape along it and it creates a, if you space out these lines at the right degrees and run a piece of metal over it, it will actually have the relationship to a piece of audio. And so ordification is really the basis for a lot of interesting things, but it doesn't sound quite as nice as sonification. And the starter of what we're going to do here is ordification. And I'll show you some fun ways of subsequently working with that. So to operate this patch, and we're loading in a piece of information called that's accessed from the Voyager probes. And at the end, I'll talk to you about loading in your own information once that's all formatted. But one of the first pieces of data I started collecting was this information from the Voyager probes, and particularly their plasma readers. And at the time, I had no idea what a plasma reader was. I still don't particularly have an idea, but it sounded cool. And so on that probe, we have 3 plasma readers. And in this instance, I'm taking the reading from the first plasma reader, and I'm converting that to a value between, you want it basically to be in a range of -1 to 1. And that's because that's our audio range. So if you have something that's above or below that, you can see how some of this stuff actually is already pushing towards the top of this sound buffer. If you have anything that's going above that, then it's just going to distort. And so for audio rate, we want -1 to 1. I think to amp the audio a little bit, I've done -5 to 5 in my scale there, but general rule of thumb, -1 to 1. The other thing that we need to do in Max is we have a little button to turn the audio on and off. This is like our output that lets us play back our audio into the world. And so I turn that on, and we probably all heard a little bit of sound. It was very quiet, but that was my buffer just playing automatically. And in terms of what we actually are going to hear, it's going to be a noisy variation of what that signal represents sonically. And so if I turn on this loop and then press play, we very, very quickly hear a repetitive sound. We can turn down that speed. And this is what I mean about basically it being very similar to just running across an object very, very quickly. You're taking the peaks and troughs of that audio signal and just playing it back extremely fast. But we can start getting to interesting places by using a couple of simple parameters. So we can slow it down, so we're running through the data at a much slower rate. And we can also turn on pitch shifting and time stretch. So this is kind of the most basic reinterpretation of taking that data, putting it into audio rate, and basically one sample of audio rate is one sample of data just converted to that -1 to 1 range. A really useful object in Max for doing that conversion is the scale object. In this instance, I have pre-worked out, and now I would probably do this programmatically. But when I made this example back in the day, I just went into the spreadsheet and found the lowest value and the highest value, and then you choose the subsequent scale you want to remap that to. And then you get the output of that being an audio range. For folks that are interested in doing that with multiple streams of data, so that same data set, but as we saw, we had 3 plasma readers, can read that in and play it back. But this one I don't think has time stretching on. So you can make your own noise band very easily. Again, not super exciting, but if we apply some of those elements of time stretch, we quite quickly get somewhere quite interesting. And when we look at the later work, we'll see how that audification become very useful for not actually listening to the sound, but providing control values for working with different methods of synthesis. So having a control voltage can be really useful for us to control all sorts of things. And I'll showcase a little plugin I built that uses that later. Okay. Another thing I wanted to introduce you to in this sort of smorgasbord of looking at stuff, and if things aren't linking for you, then I will reshare. So for me, I just tried to open from the downloaded one, and the jit.cell block didn't work. So if it didn't work, I'll reload this later with all the files working. But we have the ability to to turn a matrix. So in this instance, a matrix contains image-based data into sound. And again, it's going to sound quite noisy because essentially what's happening here is there's a specific object in Max called jit.peak, which allows us to run over that sound as an audio, that image as an audio wave. And basically, I'm just generating a random sample of noise, and you can then sort of play it back. So again, like a very noisy, rough and ready method of reinterpreting something. But I wanted to showcase that you can hold a lot of information other than image data in an image that can be useful for reading back. You might not want to listen to that sound, but you could use it to translate things. For example, if you wanted to translate something across space, you could play that sound and then have a separate microphone picking it up, and then you could reinterpret that sound back into the image. So you can do interesting things through translation and transmission, even though the sounds sound really noisy. It's containing that information that can be retranslated. So I wanted to kind of give you that as an idea. I guess this isn't available to me too. So let's see. Real-time video is another kind of, I guess it's a visual way of working, but what we can do is we can bring in some kind of visual, we can bring in a visual, or we can bring in a video, and we can use it as a way of taking in real-time pixel averaging to control a sound. So if I bring in an audio file, let's do this one. So we can take information from a real-time visual source, and we can see it mapped out here in this little graph. And we can take that information and use it as a way of controlling, say, playback of a file. So this would be another slightly more abstract way of taking some piece of information in real time and converting that into a real-time response. And what I have found from sort of a number of years of doing things that have technology and audios and visuals is often the really simple relationships are the things that hit the best, where someone can just go up to a camera or go up to a device and put their hand over it and something happens. Something that's very immediate and accessible is generally the best thing. So being able to go like, I'm sorry, because it's like I'm smashing you in the face of my hand, but something very simple like that can be quite effective. And you can try obviously like different videos. Let's do this video of some chickens and see what that sounds like. And obviously you can push those values a little bit more, make it more pronounced so that pitch bend is more specific. That probably should have been in the third folder. And finally, gosh, I guess the folder I'm working from is all unlinked. That's okay. Yeah. Finally, I wanted to showcase, again, working with that Voyager data. And this is getting more into a sort of a very basic sonification approach, where we're taking some form of synthesis and we're taking a piece of data and using that to change how that synthesis is carried out. So again, I have those three layers of the plasma detectors, and so I've sort of been quite consistent, I guess, with this Voyager data in these little tutorials. And if I turn on this Metro basically is a tool in Max that allows us to just create regular time impulses. So the speed of that Metro is how quickly we can cycle through something. The lower the speed, so the closer to 1, the faster that's going to fire. Because it's basically the number of milliseconds between impulses. So we could see if I hook up this object called a bang, we can see that bang is just being output consistently. But if I take it to 660 milliseconds, we can see that impulse is happening at a slower rate because it's actually 1,375 milliseconds versus 1 millisecond. But for cycling through data quite fast, we want a good fast speed. And then I'm just going to turn up the volume and turn up the carrier frequency and the harmonicity. And turn this to okay, sorry, that's a question. Yeah, that's a great question, Catherine. In that instance, I was using an object, and we'll look at some image translation later. And actually, that might be a good when we get into the new things, that might be a good thing to look at as our first object. But in the real-time video, I'm using an object called jit.3m. And so remember how I mentioned that we had different types of signals in Max? The gray signals are the number signals, the little dotted lines here going from jitter, these green dotted lines, denote that that's image data. And if we were working with audio specific signal generation, then that would be yellow dotted lines. So what jit.3m does is it creates the mean of those outputs. So it's basically averaging the pixels per frame. So it's just giving you the average red, green, blue per frame. So it's quite a basic output. You just kind of get like a curve based on the luminosity over time. We'll look at an example that a bit better does the pixel analysis for actual relationships as we move through. But that's a great question. The final thing that I wanted to sort of show you here is how I used to sort of think about processing data. So we've looked at this Voyager data stuff a lot today. And remember how I said it had to be for Max in a specific format. And at the time, I was just working with these calls. So what I did, and we're going to look at some slightly better ways of working with data, or at least easier access ways. Because in instances like this, it's not really a catch-all, right? Like it's going to be specific for each data set. You have to go in and you have to look at the columns you want to extract, and you have to, it's a process. So this is sort of like a blueprint of how I used to do this, where I go in, I take the columns I wanted to extract. Sometimes the information was missing large chunks as well. So you have to sort of work out what to do if you're missing various bits of information. But this is what that data set would look like. You can see that here in this final column here, which I've labeled no, guess I don't want that one. Everything's kind of chunked about between various things, but this is kind of that data set, which I'm loading in via this script, and then I'm basically selecting the pieces of information I want to read out and put into an output CSV file, which is what I would then work with in processing, which would look like this. So I've specifically formatted it to have that index, which is represented by I, and then these three plasma detector values, and finally my semicolon to format it for a call. We're going to get into looking at some stuff that doesn't require us to do that, and we can still work with data when we look at the new things.
Dan, it's
Yeah.
Dan.
Hey.
So reformatting, it was a question I asked earlier when you were showing us the call object. Is that reformatting something ChatGPT could do with any accuracy, or have you tried doing that?
Yeah, ChatGPT can do that. Basically, you just need to know how for that code-based process, and when we look at some of the new stuff, it kind of takes away the need to actually do that reformatting.
Right.
But ChatGPT can certainly format things in a call. All you need to do is just know the specific columns that you want to extract. Because if we look at the processing code, we can see I've kind of labeled up the columns that I was interested in, and I think I'd gone in and like given the headers specific names.
Right.
And so what I'm doing is I'm creating a mechanism to write out a piece of text, loading that in, and then just selecting those rows one by one and just writing that as the piece of information. But yeah, ChatGPT, if you know the rows you want to access, it has a great method for loading information specifically for data and analyzing. So we have like, these different kind of outputs we can do. So data analysts can be really useful for like dragging a piece of information. So I could actually find that CSV file that I want to work with. And you can actually just drag that in. And it can take a minute, but I could be like, it's often good in that instance because it's really good on Python, less good on Mac stuff, because Max is less, it's well cataloged, but a lot of if you actually look at like Max patcher code online, it's translating the image, the node-based stuff into its own sort of like markdown language. So, but you could be like, if you just reference what call format is, index, and then it will analyze that. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it has for doing something pretty that you want to be like that's really just like a very menial data task. It can be really helpful for speeding that up. And you can look through the analysis as well, so you can get an idea of what the code actually looks like.
Cool.
And so then let's see what it will give you. We'll look back at that later
Sure.
if it gives us something good. But yeah, I think it's a great tool to add to our toolbox of just taking out a lot of that boring like stuff that we don't, is useful to know how to do, but if there's some other way of processing the data, why not use that? Okay. So some more fun and exciting ways of turning things into sound. So we're going to look at Touch Designer in a little bit, but let's keep in Max for the time being. And I'm just going to introduce you to image grains. And this is a while ago, I made a little project where I brought DALL-E. I don't know who's familiar with that, but I brought DALL-E's API into Max and created like a way of basically loading in images and then turning those into sound. But it doesn't have to be AI generated images. It can be any type of image. So let's find an image that looks cool. I recently just deleted everything from my computer, so I don't have too many cool images. So that's okay. Earth. And so the process for this is you can load in an image or a video, and then you can load in a sample. So again, let's go with cryptid. And what's happening is really we're taking a chunk of this image, we're really downsampling it, and we're taking columns and rows and using that to control a way of basically cutting up an audio file. So it's different columns are controlling the loop length or the pitch. You know, that didn't sound very interesting. So let's choose something a lot better. Okay, let's use my face. And it can take a minute to update. Okay, so we can kind of hear how we can hear how different images are being reinterpreted differently. This patch is in something called presentation mode. So what I've done is I basically put it in a nice way of viewing it, so you don't actually have to see all the guts behind it. But if you're interested in the behind the scenes, you just click this little presentation mode viewer, and you can see what's going on. It's not too dense. But what I'm using for the audio generation is a package in Max called MC, which stands for multi-channel, which means that rather than having 20 or 30 different, basically copying the same thing 20 or 30 times, it's a way of having 20 audio signals packaged in one wrapper. And then I'm using those audio signals to control the playback of these samples. So if people want to send me some pictures a little bit later, we can load these in and see what different pictures will sound like. So that can be kind of fun. But I want to introduce us to Touch Designer really quickly, and how we might work with that to do some audification stuff and to do some more fun things. So I'm going to go into this project here called Audify. And it's also going to be a good crash course in how we can actually take data from pretty much any file and actually work with it without having to do too much silly formatting. Okay, I'm just going to go to my downloads folder and just get this as well, because okay, there we go. Okay, so this is what the Audify Touch Designer session looks like. And like Max, we can see it's a node-based environment. So we have all these different objects that we're connecting together. In Touch Designer, to create objects, we can double-click. And by double-clicking on the background, we're creating this create dialog box. And we can also just press the tab key to bring that up. There's a number of objects, and this is more just today's workshop will really be more kind of using the tools that I've put together. So don't worry about the whole building stuff out section, but there's a lot of different components of InTouch, and they're all useful for different things. So for example, the top components is for working with textures. So if you're working with generating imagery or processing images, that's what you'd want to use. Chops are for working with data that's in a time sequence. So this is data that's already been put into some kind of sequence that we want to work with. And we'll be working a bit with chops to take our data from a spreadsheet and put them into time series. SOP is for 3D, materials are for texturing, so we don't need to worry about those. And DAT is for data, so that's going to be very useful to us. A really good rule of thumb actually is if you bring something into touch, so let's say I have a piece of data that I want to bring in, like this satellite positional data, I can bring it into touch just by dragging, and it will automatically create the right data type for me. So we can see that I have my spreadsheet with all sorts of bits and bobs in here already loaded into touch in the correct data format. And actually that might be a good as a starter to just show how the data we can format it into actual time series data would be a good thing to look at. So what we would do in this instance is, first off, I would want to just review which actual columns and rows I want to use. So in this instance, I'm not interested in the naming data. I would be interested in these rows here. So row 10 to 16, which is going to have my longitude, perigee, apogee, eccentricity, inclination, declination. So this would really be the stuff that would define the orbits. To create an object that sorts that information just to be the channels that we want, I'll click on this outlet here. All these objects have outlets on the side. They're not. This is the problem with touch, is the UI is not always that clear, which is why I didn't like it when I started playing with it. And if I hit the tab key, then I can create a select. And what select will allow me to do is select a series of columns or a series of rows. And I always, even after a long time of doing this stuff, I always still get confused between columns and rows. I have to be like, columns go down, rows go across. And so I'll go select columns by index, and I want to start at column 10 and end at column 16. And now we can see that I have a condensed data sheet, which is going to be really useful for us to actually do something with. And so at this point, we've kind of like harvested the columns that we actually want to use. And now we want to convert from a data sheet into time series data that looks like this. And this is something I already did earlier, which is already in that project. And the way of doing that, and the mistake I often make, is I just drag out from here and I go to the green and I say DAT2. DAT2 is the object we want to use, but if I directly move into that, it can take quite a long time to compute, because it's computing rather than all the columns, which I want to get nicely and succinctly into these time series data. It's going to collate every row. So it's going to run through, and I think it's 73,000 columns, and it's a lot, 73,000 rows, sorry. So easier to do is just make that DAT2 before it's connected and get it set up the way you want it. I know I'm kind of jumping through things quite quickly, but this is being recorded, so we can go back through it, and I can stick around at the end to help folks out. The DAT2 allows us to sequence information in various ways from a data. And we actually want to see what's the parameters in our DAT. For most people, you'll probably have something on your screen that looks like this. If you don't worry. This is the parameters window, and it's brought up by clicking on an object. So if I move to a different object, we see a different set of parameters. Clicking on an object and pressing the P key, P for P-TEC. So if I press the P key, I can make it visible or hidden. And so the basis of it is it's going to create a channel per row. So if you have a long row of information, it will create a channel, which is basically like we can think of as a waveform. But we don't want to do that for the row because our rows have all this other data. They have the naming of the thing. We just want the column. We want everything underneath longitude of geo degrees, all that good stuff. So what we do on the output is we say channel per column, and first row is names and first column is values. And now if we move this across, and what's kind of again counterintuitive about Touch Designer is this DAT2 doesn't have a physical inlet that we can drag to. We have to think a little bit more conceptually about linking things together. And it's not that conceptual at all, but it's slightly more than just dragging an arrow. And what we have to do is we have this little field that says DAT. And this is basically where we want, it's a reference for what piece of information we want to read. So in this case, we know our information that we want to read is in this section here. So what we do is we take it and we drag it onto our DAT2, and then we get this little arrow. So we can see this process that I drag it, an arrow appears, which means I can maneuver it to someplace else. And we want to drop it onto that DAT. And we can see now that there's a sort of, I always have trouble describing this, a sort of a broken up arrow, which is showing that there's a data connection between these two objects. And we can also see that our data is now nicely in there in sort of time series data, in time series sequence. And then we can work with that. So I'm going to delete that and showcase more of the tool I wanted to show to you. And for our use, it's relatively easy to use. So we can basically put any single stream of data into this script that I've written, and we can run this script, and then we can make something happen. So let's try. So I've got this sun series data. So I've got my number of sunspots, and I've gone through this data sheet using just the process we looked at to get the specific column I want, which is number of sunspots. It's all loaded in. For this, I've also used something called a sort to just allow me to get the smallest and largest value. The Python I've written actually automatically normalizes the data, so you don't need to do that, but it can be a helpful thing to do. I'm then scaling it using a mathematical chop, which is like the scale in MaxMSP, from the smallest and the largest range on that sheet to the audio range that I want, and then running it through. And I'm going to run this script. So under this little script here, we can right click and click view. It's a Python script. So we can run Python in Touch Designer as well. So this is really anything you connect into this final channel here called input. So it's important not to delete that. And it's important also not to delete this rename. Basically, any information you can plug into this rename, and then you can hear what it sounds like. So let's hear what that sun sequence data sounds like. So I'm going to run the script. Depending on your computer, it might hang for a second as it runs that Python file. To run the script, you click on the script, which is this kind of pinky object that says audio file. Right click and select run script. If you're someone that likes key commands, you can also do Command R, and it will run that script. And it should, if we're lucky, it should output that into the Audify file. And like we heard earlier with those audifications, we get that very glitchy time series data. Very, we get essentially it's just inputting an approximate distortion of our headphones to make a file. So the one thing we can do that will make this slow down and speed up is we can play with the value on this resample chop here. So this is just a little mathematical, very simple way of moving things around. So the baseline audio rate is 44,100 per second, but we can if the lower the value here is, we can make a faster output audio file. So let's do a multiplication and run that script. And now that should play back. And so it's a little faster. And I've put together a little just method of playing back this audification. So any audification that you create, you can play back, you can load it in. So you got to find that audio file, which for me obviously is a process. And you see it's loaded in. We can click this play button. You hear it playing back. Let's turn on some pitch shifting to do something cool. And just to show you that this can apply to lots and lots of different types of information, even information that we have not necessarily created from a data sheet. In Touch Designer, there's lots of different objects for generating noise or sine waves or cycles, which can be used to control various parameters. But we can output any of this through our process as well. So this is, again, it's going to sound quite noisy. This is just a chunk of noise. I'm going to run the script, and it might be quite short. Let's see how long we get. So we get 5 seconds of that audio. And let's play it back so we can actually pitch shift it, because that one was quite bassy. And so, for example, if I created a pattern which allows us to create different audiovisual tones. So let's do a sine wave. I'm going to pump up that number of cycles to something like 400 because we want it to be audible. So we can think about 400 cycles per second, about 400 hertz. My mapping is not exact, so it's not going to be a 400 hertz sine wave exactly. And we can hear, oh, we get something that's super short. So let's elongate our time by first off actually plugging it into the correct component, which for me would be the resample. I'm plugging that resample in. I'll run that script. And now let's see, it might be quite high pitched. And so if you wanted a longer tone, then you can play around with that resample. So let's do a smaller multiplication. And you know what? I'm going to do 220, make it a little bit quieter, run the script, and it's fairly fast. So this is a way of outputting all sorts of time series data. And it shouldn't matter too much if the data is at like a very is mapped or not. So for example, I could take in this this apogee component, which is really not mapped obviously between -1 and 1. I'll put that into my resample and run that script. And it's going to automatically normalize that within -1 and 1. Something that I could probably even out, but my script doesn't do is it doesn't normalize it always to audio range. So what you can do in a program like, say, Audacity, is you can go in, select the audio, and then just go to normalize. And then that will just normalize it to be more concretely between 0 and between -1 and 1 in the center there. But we can kind of compare these visually, we can see that we've essentially just stamped that piece of information into audio rate. And so we can do some cool things with that as control values. And that will be something I show in a second. I know we're at 3. Are folks okay if I keep going? There's one more thing I want to show that I think is kind of fun, probably the most interesting thing. Okay, so I'm going to quit this and flick back. And so I'm going to go to image to sound. And there's a couple of things here. So there's sort of 2 components. So there's the image to sound touch designer file. And there's a separate component which is in Max. And so the Max component is called Siphon Scale. There we go. The problem with this for folks is that Siphon is not a native package to Max. So there's a little bit of a process to install that. Basically, what Siphon allows us to do is to stream visual data from one engine to another. If you're on a Windows PC, it's called Spout and not Siphon. So I think this is unfortunately only native to Mac. So I'll demo it, and people who are on Mac can install this Siphon. I can build something for Spout. I have a Windows machine here, so if anyone is on Windows and wants to use this, I will share this with you, and then you can work on this. I just don't have it readily available right now. But I can certainly make that for you if people are interested in going through this on a Windows machine. The process of installing a external package in this manner, whether it be Siphon or Spout in Max, is you would have to go to Elaine, great to see you, would be to go to sorry, pardon me, lost my train of thought, would be go to the package manager. So you go in Max File, Show Package Manager. And then this is really where all the add-ons to Max live that you might want to use. In this case, Siphon or Spout. And so you can click on that and click install. So in my case, I can't install Spout on my Mac. I can install it on my Windows, and vice versa for Siphon. If you're on a PC, it won't necessarily work. But you would go onto the add-on and press install. In my case, it's already there, so I can press launch, which gives you the output that shows that it's working. So in this context, what I can do is I can send information between Touch Designer and Max, and then use Max, which is much more powerful for turning audio into turning signals into audio. And I'll show you some of the more fun features first. So the fun feature is if I plug in via this switch. So the switch basically allows us to move between different data types. And I think I want to do data type 2. Let's just check that I do. There we go. In my instance, I'm just going to load this up again, because often it works slightly better if you open Max first, so it can find Siphon, which in my case it wasn't. You know what? It's because I had this open in the background. You can only have one. You can give multiple names to the Siphon channel, but you can't have conflicting. I had a background channel going on. So let's turn back image to sound. Now it should work nicely. Okay. So I'm going to flick this switch to 2, which I believe it is on. And what I'm able to do is I'm able to take an image, say, of the cosmic microwave background and move through that. So if I take an image, I can use the powerful thing about touch is you can really easily convert from between different data types. So I can have an image and I can drag out of that image output and I can say top 2. So this is going to convert that image into a sequence of data. And it's reading across the image. So you can scrub up and down that image. So if I go here and go into this crop section, if I move through between 0 and 1, I'm basically scrubbing up and down through the pixels of that image. We can also automate things in touch. So what I've done is I've created something called an LFO, which basically allows us to create a ramp between various values. And I'm dragging that on, and this is, again, my touch is a bit weird. I'm dragging that on as a control value to control that vertical start. And so if I turn that frequency up, you see it's running through. We don't want to hear that. We want to hear this. And we can see that it is essentially sonifying that information. It's turning that information into a filter for some noise. And what this method is also kind of interesting for us to do is we can actually apply image-based filters to that data before it's processed. So we can apply, for example, a threshold, which chooses how much information gets through. So we're just turning these points that represent the brightest elements of that image into sound. So we're able to map things into a spectrum context. The other thing I wanted to show is, again, how that information can be sent as, right now we're sending this time series information, but we can send information that's, for example, held in a pattern, and we can output that to MIDI in various ways. So we can control various, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to close that. We can control various parameters in MIDI, which we can then send to different outputs. So we can use that to control music software. Okay. So there was one more thing I wanted to show, and this will be the last thing. But let's take a look at an additional file I just added a bit later to page 27. And also, because there's so few of us now, if folks have questions, just fire them off and we can go through them. But there's a little plugin I've made that will work in Macs, but it will also it's fully loadable into Ableton. And what it does is it takes that information I mean, initially I actually made it because I'm working on a project with some seismic, some volcanologists. What it will allow us to do is take in an audio file. So for example, the audified output that we're working with, and it will read that back. There's two versions. There's a MIDI version, and the MIDI version really would only work in Ableton Live. But what it allows you to do is to take that information and map it to a parameter. So if you had like a frequency filter or something, or control pitch or whatever, you can map it to that. So that's one version of that. But then we have this seismic audio, which you can apply to all sorts of things. So if I go into replace, we can listen to the raw output. We can control things like the speed. Also, pardon me, it is actually pretty much set for Ableton, so I just have to tweak some things. I'll provide one that just is a standalone for you folks as well. So right now we've got the boring blah, 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 blah. Okay. We can listen to it as a sine wave. We can also control the step, which is how fast we move through that data. Can listen to a modulated version. But most interestingly is we can apply that as a playback curve to another piece of audio. So let's take that cryptid audio again. And so if I, for example, went back into one of those Touch Designer patches to output a different kind of output, let's go back and output this one. Then that can be applied basically any audio file as well. So if you have like another audio file, it can be basically applied as a control signal. So I could go. But let's say I wanted to output this let's see, this apogee from the satellites. If I ran that, grab that data. And I believe it's in the downloads one. Yeah, it's perfect. It should be a different audio file. So it provides a few quick ways of turning that ordified information into something that's actually a bit more usable. And then finally, if you were to bring in the MIDI control version into something like live, and this is where we're moving more into sonification versus audification territory. Let's do. That's better. Then this could be mapped to something like, for example, like volume, and it's not necessarily gonna, you can play around with its offset and things like that, like how wildly it's mapping those parameters. So let's actually load something. Let's load in an instrument. Okay. Output it through Zoom so you can hear it too. Let's see. So by kind of playing around with those things, you can start controlling various elements. And basically it's as simple as clicking on the map and then clicking on that variable. And let's see if that. And again, this applies to any sort of audio you might want to put into that system. And then it's useful to sort of normalize it with various things. Okay. So I guess we've run quite a bit long, so I'm going to stop there. And are there any questions?
Well, a few.
Mm.
That's best for another time, I think.
Okay. Yeah, feel free
Thank
to
you.
email me
Thank
as
you
well.
very much. Okay.
Yeah, feel free to
Uh,
email me. I'll just put my email in the chat because I don't think I attached it in the thing.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll make a spout one for PC users.
Hi, Dan. We
Okay.
had a question. So between Max and Touch Designer, could you feasibly do everything that you've done in Max in Touch Designer? Is it just a matter of like how familiar you are in that environment, or is it better
Yeah.
for dealing with all of the data and
That's a really good question. Touch Designer is not as good for audio. They recently, in the last couple of years, added in a VST component, so you can load in VSTs and then you can automate them. I can send you some stuff on getting started with that. It's it's not super simple, but not super hard. So you'll be able to do it for sure. There's a few things that like touch in general is a lot of the audio functionality is really just for playback of audio. There's like one oscillator so you could have an oscillator say and have that go up and down based on pitch. Max is a lot more fleshed out for sound stuff. So it really depends on what you want to do. But if, for example, you wanted to take in some input sounds and manipulate them in touch, you could do that in a few basic ways. One, and I'll show you this as a quick thing, because actually this is really useful for folks in general. And I wanted to touch on this, but I forgot until now. I don't know if folks are familiar with this thing called open sound control.
Oh, a little heard of.
So open sound control is like your thing if you want to send values between like touch and max and actually have it really simple. So there's going to be an OSC in or out. So if you're sending from max to touch, you'll do the OSC in. Let's send from touch designer to max. I'll make a new max patch as well. Side by side. And so what you got to do really, the thing that's important is you just have to set a port. It's automatically going to be on port 10,000. Similar to Siphon, you saw when I had those two things open at the same time, it will read the first one that it links into. So if you want to send multiple pieces of information, you can send multiple pieces of information to a specific endpoint, but this OSC out, you can't have another OSC out on port 10,000, otherwise it will create an issue for you. So let's say I want to make something in touch, and I'm just gonna create this a random thing. Let's do it as a time sequence. So I'll use time slice to just run through that. OSC is good for information that's updating frame by frame. It's less good for sending like large chunks of data that would be in an array format. So we can see that it's going. Maybe I'll add in like I want to smooth it out or something. So I'll add in a filter. So let's say this is some information that I want to send to Max to do something. So basically I've already created the object in touch that's sending, it's going out of the network port 10,000. In Max, we want to create a UDP receive. And so it's using the same protocol as OSC, but it's just got a different name. And we want to hook up to that port 10,000. And now if I put a message and look through what that message is sending, we should see that whatever the name coming through that filter, in this instance, Chan1, I could rename that to something, whatever you want really. But you see how that information is coming through. The only thing you would then have to do in Max is then essentially be like route that data. So I'm going to route my data, and then you get rid of, and it has to be the correct syntax of the slash as well. You get rid of that slash, and then it's something you can actually use.
Okay.
In this instance, I'm just sending one channel. But for example, if I had, if I copied this again and did something, let's like a different tone, you can merge various pieces together. So I'm going to merge this, I'm going to merge that. So we have two channels, Chan1, Chan2. One's going to be called my data, and then one's going to be called, I guess, Chan2, unless I renamed it something different. So now we have these two pieces of information coming through. So you can really add in as many streams as you like into that. Going the opposite way, if I wanted to send something from Max to touch, and I do this quite a lot. I do quite a bit of VJing, and rather than bringing like a MIDI controller with me, I like to program things out in Max. So actually I did a set a few nights ago, and so I just put together the controls I wanted in Max, so then I could just like hook it into hook it into touch. I'll show you that at the end if you like. But basically, we just do a UDP send. And there's a bit more stuff we have to do in Max to hook that up. We have to give it the network address. In this case, we're not sending over a network, we're sending like on our local computer. So that's always going to be, if we're sending locally, 127.0.0.1. And then we just assign a port. So like I'll say port 9000. And then to send that data, we'll create a name. So max data. And then for something that's going to be an updating variable after that, we do $1. So now if I have like an integer going into that and I set up a listener in touch as a OSC out, OSC in even. On port 9000. If I wiggle that around, now that's feeding into touch from Mac. So we can create those relationships. But then, for example, if I wanted to just turn that output from touch into sound, we know kind of, because it's just a basic pattern, that the scale of that value is going to be between like -1 and 1. And let's do like I guess I don't want it to be too high pitched. So I'm just going to pop it into like a cycle tilde. We can also like see what value is coming out. So I'm just scaling it up. You can do that in touch too. I'm just doing it in Max. And then we'll do an output. Connect that up. You get like, your wobble. If I took off that filter, it would be less nice. In this instance as well, I should yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. You can send that data through, and it can be anything you like. But that's a very handy way of sending through lots of stuff really quickly. And if you take away those time slices or whatever, you can go through and you can go crazy. And that's how a lot of the control stuff for the stuff was coming through. So yeah, it's a useful thing to have in your back pocket is OSC for just sending things really quickly on the fly.
Thanks, that was great.
That doesn't necessarily answer your questions. But yeah, you can do audio stuff in touch. It's just a lot less powerful. So if you want to do anything specific, like, for example, when we turn the image into a bunch of like grains, that would be really hard to do in touch, but really efficient in Max. So it's finding the skills and the strengths of both tools that work for you. Okay. Any other questions? No?
Oh, I was going to ask about the next workshop, but maybe that at the very end.
Sure. Yeah, so the next workshop in February, right? In a few weeks. And so that's going to be more looking at building some basic tools to collect information and turning that into sound quite immediately. We'll be using like little handheld amps and just there won't even be any soldering or anything like that. I've put together a little list of things we need so we can kind of prototype things with alligator clips. But basically, it's going to be very simple conversions of sensors into audio frame rate. We're not even going to use things like Arduino for this. But we're going to look at how we can capture those signals in various ways and use them as audio source and as control.
Sounds great.
Okay.